Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful event. This event will have live captioning throughout. I'd like to welcome you with us today. My name is Dr. Anu Taranath. I am faculty here at the University of Washington. I do a lot of work around race, racial justice. I teach about global issues and globalization. I do a lot with study abroad and international education and many projects that think about reciprocity and global collaboration. I'm also a racial equity consultant, and I work throughout our region, bringing people together to talk through what feels sticky, what feels hard, what hope and hurt mean in our lives. And I'm so excited to be here today. I'd like to start by thanking our hosts, the UW Office of Global Affairs and UW Study Abroad, for organizing this event and inviting me to moderate it. The UW Office of Global Affairs is a hub for international engagement here at UW and seeks to build global perspectives among our faculty, staff, students, and community. This event celebrates Black History Month, and we are excited to present this very special conversation on race and restorative justice. Next, I would like to give a warm thank you to our UW sponsors for their support, the Jackson School of International Studies, our partner, the Center for Global Studies, the Samuel E. Kelly Ethnic Cultural Center, the School of Social Work, Women's Center, and for the many other outreach and organizational partners across campus. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Snoqualmie, Tulalip, Muckleshoot nations. We acknowledge the people, past, present, and future, the Duwamish tribe, the Muckleshoot tribe, and other tribes on whose traditional lands we study and work. Before I introduce our special guest for this evening, I'd like to give a brief overview of how tonight's conversation will be structured. We will start with a few words from our guest, Dr. Fania Davis, followed by questions and conversation between she and I. We will then follow with audience questions from the chat. So we very much encourage you to think, listen, and share with us what you're thinking, right? I'm now excited and honored to introduce Dr. Fania Davis. Fania Davis is a leading national voice on restorative justice. She is a longtime social justice activist, civil rights trial attorney. She's a writer, a restorative justice practitioner, and an educator with a PhD in Indigenous knowledge. Coming of age in Birmingham, the murder of two close childhood friends in the 1963 Sunday school bombing crystallized within Fania a passionate commitment to social transformation. For the next decades, she was active in the civil rights, Black liberation, women's, prisoners, peace, anti-racial violence, economic justice, and anti-apartheid movements. Studying with Indigenous African healers catalyzed Fania's search for a healing justice, ultimately leading her to serve as the founding director of Restorative Justice of Oakland Youth and co-founding board member of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. Her numerous honors include the Ubuntu Award for Service to Humanity, the Dennis Mulhoney Award for Excellence in Youth Restorative Justice, the Black Feminist Shapeshifters and Waymakers Award, the Tikkun Repair the World Award, the Ella Baker Joe Baker Human Rights Award, and the Ebony Power 100 Award. The Los Angeles Times named her a new civil rights leader of the 21st century. Among her publications is this wonderful book here, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, Black Lives, Healing, and US Social Transformation. Welcome, Fania. We are so delighted to have you with us tonight. Let's please begin with you sharing with us what restorative justice is. What are the basics? Why is this an important concept for us to be holding and considering, especially now?
Thank you so much, Anu. Um, Thank you, UW Office of Global Affairs and all of the other sponsors of this event. And thank you out there in the audience for being here this evening with us. I want to say thank you for the land acknowledgement there. And I'd like to add a land acknowledgement for the land where I live, work, and play. Mm. This is in Oakland, the unceded territory of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. We acknowledge the ancestors of the land as a way of saying and acknowledging actually that this is an occupied land. Not that much different really from the occupied land of the West Bank, or the occupied land of Ukraine. This is a post-genocidal land, not unlike the post-genocidal lands of Rwanda and Germany. So it's important to say that, to name that, because we have for so long buried these truths. We have so long silenced these truths. So thank you so much for doing this land acknowledgement. I want to say just one other thing. Please. The land acknowledgements, the symbolism, the words are really important, as I just said. And it's important for us to find out what kind of, ideally from Indigenous peoples of your land, what can we do to show our solidarity? What can we do to support your sovereignty? What kinds of reparations can we make so that we use our words and we use our action in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land? And I want to very quickly say that in Oakland, the Chochenyo Ohlone people have asked us to pay an annual land tax. It's the Shumi land tax that goes to the Shogaria Land Trust to allow them to reclaim stewardship and care of the land here where I live. I also want to, this is kind of the way we begin Restorative Justice Circles and other events. We honor the ancestors. We do a very often very simple ceremonies, but some sort of ceremony to mark the space that we're about to enter as a special one, as a sacred one. So I want to honor the lost souls of Texas with the climate disaster just last week, and their blood is really on the hands of deregulation, privatization, and these energy private industries that are not operating energy enterprises to help the people and to meet the needs of people, but to create profit. And I also want to honor the 500,000, Anu, 500,000.
Yeah. Yes.
Lost souls.
Yes.
Again, it's due to deregulation and privatization of healthcare.
Yes.
We don't have enough hospitals. We didn't have enough medicines because in private enterprises, you don't want surplus. You want to sell everything. And of course, due to presidential mismanagement and systemic racial disparities, these 500,000 people lost their lives. Mm-hmm. And of course, I also want to honor those who have been lost to police terror. Police terror, since for 401 years. Of course, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and the list goes on and on and on. May their deaths not be in vain.
Our conversation tonight is you and I, and yet in so doing, you have invited so many more in, right? In widening our lens in this way.
Yes, welcome.
Mm-hmm.
spirits that bless and empower this gathering, we
Yes.
welcome you.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So a few words about restorative justice. We're going to see a very short video a little later, but just want to say that restorative justice invites a new way of thinking about justice, a new paradigm of thinking about and doing justice. Justice well, actually crime is seen as harm to people, to relationships. Justice is seen as healing that harm, very simply put.
Yes.
Restorative justice is rooted in Indigenous worldview. So it's more than a conflict resolution method. Most people know it as that. It's more than a theory of justice. It is a way of life. It is a way of being present to one another and to the earth in ways that bring healing and wholeness rather than in ways that bring more harm and discord and devastation. So it's really important to know that about restorative justice. Both it's a theory of justice and a way of life, really, that's rooted in Indigenous ways. Also, I want to say that, well, you know, a lot of people say that, well, restorative justice isn't transformative because it just wants to take you back to the anti-status quo, back to whatever existed before the harm occurred. And that is a misunderstanding. And that is a false dichotomy often that is posed between transformative justice and restorative justice. It's not restorative to me if it isn't transformative, especially given my history of social transformation, movements, civil rights trial lawyer fighting racism. So that transformative impact is so important. And when we talk about restorative justice, there we're really talking about honoring that innate goodness in every human being, that equal moral worth and dignity in every human being. Indeed, that divine spark in every human being. Namaste is the way that it's expressed in Eastern traditions. So that is what we are restoring. We're restoring after trauma, after harm. We really work toward restoring the dignity and the wholeness of our highest selves. And we create spaces where people are very often encouraged to bring forth their highest self in these processes. So that's the kind of restoration we're talking about. Not going back to some abusive relationship or anything like that.
Yes, thank you. The entire framework sits so differently within society, no? When you go from punishment to healing, something very different happens within us, within our communities, and outside of us as well, no? Something very different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about that a little bit more after we share the short video. But I did want to say a few other things that, you know, I love this idea of exploring the intersections of international travel and restorative justice. I've never been asked to have a conversation about that or think about it or write about it. So this is a maiden voyage, and you're such a great travel partner. So there is a lot of stuff happening internationally with restorative justice. Many years ago, I think in the 90s, the UN urged all its member nations to adopt restorative justice. Restorative justice programs you'll find in hundreds of countries. The West European Restorative Justice Forum is one of the international organizations. New Zealand has actually made juvenile incarceration virtually obsolete when it passed its restorative justice laws in 1989. There are restorative justice programs all over New Zealand, of course, rooted in Maori traditions, in Australia, in Africa, South Africa especially. There are actually restorative cities, which I've been wanting to do research about, but haven't gotten around to it yet. But there are a number of restorative cities in Europe, in New Zealand as well. Yeah. So I think it's for people who are interested in travel, you know, there are a lot of opportunities to do restorative justice work abroad.
Certainly. No, in my introduction, I shared a little bit about all the various movements that you have traveled through and all the different kinds of roles that you have taken in this. You have participated in such a wide variety of movements for greater justice, dignity, and opportunity over the decades. You've also written about how important it is to be both warrior as well as healer, right? I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about your life story through activism and your journey about what it means to be both warrior and healer, please.
Sure, Anu. Thank you for that question. So I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. You may know it as Birmingham, but we called it Birmingham because of the frequency of the racial terror, the bombing by the Ku Klux Klan and other racial hate groups directed against those of us who were in the rising civil rights movement. They did this, of course, with the intent to terrorize us into silence, to intimidate us, to frighten us, but it had just the opposite effect. So let me talk just a bit about my childhood. So some of the first words that I learned to spell and read were colored, C-O-L-O-R-E-D, because those signs were omnipresent, especially in the downtown area. Earliest memories are sounds of bombs going off in the middle of the night. We were very blessed. Our home was never hit, but homes all around us were hit. Sounds of my father jumping out of bed in the middle of the night and grabbing his gun and going to downstairs because he heard rustling in the bush outside. And perhaps the sound of other fathers in the neighborhood with their guns who were out there that night to protect their families. Some of our games involved, well, you know, when white people drove by in their cars, we would throw stones at them. That was our way of resisting. And then across the street was the white side of town. So we had a game where we would run across the street and ring the doorbell of the white neighbor across the street and run back as quickly as possible before anyone came to the door. So those are just a couple of stories about life in Alabama. We lived atop, I don't think I said this, we lived atop Dynamite Hill. That was our neighborhood because of all of the bombings there in Birmingham, Alabama. Down the street, our church was firebombed because we had interracial discussion groups there. Just across the street from the church, lawyer Arthur Shores, that's what we didn't say attorney, we'd say lawyer. Arthur Shores, who worked with Thurgood Marshall and single-handedly or with him brought down the walls of segregation in employment and education and industry and in housing. His home was bombed numerous times, and he took to sitting out on his front porch at night with a shotgun. And then I want to share about the bombing that probably most people know about, the 16th Street Sunday school bombing, September 15, 1963, when four young women, two of which were very close friends of mine, were murdered. by the bombs that struck 16th Street Baptist Church. They were in Sunday school. Their lesson that day, the subject of their lesson was unconditional love. Mm. How we offer unconditional love even to those who harm us. Mm. And so Carol lived a little ways, not next door to me or not in my neighborhood, but we were very close because our families took trips together out of town. We were in the same social organizations. Cynthia Wesley lived just 2 doors down from me, and we played all the time. Of course, when I look back on it, on my origin story, I see that violence plays a central role.
Yes.
And, they say that your origin story contains the seed of who you are and who you will become. All of who you will become are in that seed. And I see that my life coming out of that experience has been dedicated to creating a world without that violence. Mm. And that, I think, it partly explains my attraction to healing, to restorative justice, as well as to justice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You move from those early experiences of violence into a civil rights trial lawyer.
Yes.
3 decades
right,
in this role.
Right.
No?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And even before that, I paused just for a moment there, but I wanted to also talk about, how my husband and I were almost killed by police, continuing that violence. He was shot in the back by police. I escaped physically unharmed, but he and I had been working with the Black Panther Party in California. This was in 1969, at the apex of the Black liberation movement. COINTELPRO, of course, as well. And anyone who's involved with the Black Panther Party risked death or imprisonment, of course, and that's what happened to us. We were charged with attempted murder of police officers, even though we were the ones who were almost killed, and eventually the charges were dropped. That same year, not even a year later, this happened in November of 1969, when we were in Del Mar, California. And just in August of 1970, my sister was targeted for a legal lynching by then Governor Ronald Reagan and then President Nixon, rising out of the incident on August 7, 1970, when prisoners made an escape attempt from a courtroom in Marin County, and she was charged with murder, conspiracy, kidnapping, all capital charges. So she faced the gas chamber. So I spent a large part of my life, not a large part of my life, but that I spent every second, every waking moment of my life for 2 years working, traveling around the world. I got a lot of travel in, actually, then. I was traveling to Chile, to Cuba, to many countries in Europe, even the Soviet Union, to organize and help build international movement for her freedom, which thanks to the people, thanks to the ancestors, she was acquitted. Yeah. So
for those of us that are here and listening, Fania's book, one of the first chapters, has a beautiful and heart-wrenching rendition of some of what you are sharing with us today. You trace your origin story and trace it through the various roles that you've had, right? As warrior, as healer. And move us towards restorative justice as a call to action, as a call back to ourselves, and as a call to action. Please tell us, what is restorative justice and why exactly is this the moment for us to pay closer attention to this?
Mm-hmm. Um, I definitely want to address that. And I want to address something that you mentioned earlier.
Yes,
you talked about becoming a civil rights trial lawyer, how that experience in Alabama sort of catapulted me into that profession. And indeed it did. In Alabama, as well as with my sister, that experience with her, because the trial lawyers in her case were just amazing. And they inspired me. And so for 20 something years, 27 years, I practiced as a civil rights trial lawyer. And I continued, of course, my journey through many social movements, every major movement of my time, the women's movement, the Black students movement, the peace movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the socialist movement, and on and on and on. And I reached a point in the mid-90s, I think it was, where um, I became ill, first of all. I was out of balance, and I knew intuitively that it was because there was too much anger, too much fire in my life, too much hypermasculinity in my life, and that I was being invited by Spirit to bring in, to invite more creative and feminine and healing energies into my life. And that's when I shut down my law practice. And I had dreams and all kind of synchronistic events. I met people who ultimately led me to this program, this PhD program, Recovery of Indigenous Mind. Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to travel again all over the world, but mostly to Africa, where I spent some time working, learning from a great healer there by the name of Baba Credo Mutwa, Busama Zulu Credo Mutwa, chief healer in the Zulu tradition. And yeah, so I did that. And then when I finished the dissertation, I came back home. I was all, stoked and psyched. I wanted to do this healing work, but could find no remunerative job. After 7 years of being a student, I had to work again, but couldn't find a job. So I ended up going back into my law practice and had some really interesting experiences with my first client after initiation, an initiated man from the Nuba tribe. And I spoke to the jury a lot about his initiation and about his tribe and their values. But as a lawyer, I was invited to a conference on restorative justice. And that's how I learned about restorative justice. It was an epiphany for me because to find out, here's this justice that heals, and this justice that seeks to create more social peace than increase social conflict. This justice that is not about getting even, but about getting well, as K. Prana says. So that it was an epiphany for me because I felt that I could integrate two parts of me that seemed binary, that seemed to be opposed. I could be both healer and warrior and lawyer for that matter. Yeah. And I had a story in restorative justice that would allow that wholeness. Healing is, of course, etymologically related to wholeness, right? Yes. And holiness. So it was a very, deep moment for me to learn about this justice that heals.
You traveled abroad quite a lot in your late in your early 20s, 30s, and onward. And so much of restorative justice you have found and have written about is coming back to the ways that our ancestors have navigated harm and healing in our own communities. This is not a new concept. This is old wisdom. This is
old absolutely. Wisdom, it is. Right? It sure is.
And the indigenous roots of restorative justice, I think, is somewhat new to a lot of people, right? It's old wisdom, but I think the indigenous roots, again, we haven't quite understood why it's connected in such a profound way. And what is it about the study of self and community that gives rise to this sense of healing, not to get even, but to get well, right?
Yes,
This concept
absolutely.
of travel, right? How do
Mhm,
we learn about ourselves and others, being elsewhere and knowing differently?
mhm,
How we go, the ways that our lens opens up, the way that we develop a lens that is able to have our ear to the ground and have our ear to our own heart to be able to listen very differently, right?
mhm, mhm.
That's what restorative justice is trying to do. We're not
Absolutely,
trying to recolonize one another.
absolutely.
We're actually
Yeah,
trying to decolonize ourselves in such really
absolutely,
fundamental ways. Isn't it funny?
absolutely. Yeah, that's so right.
Mm,
And um, the whole idea of peacemaking circles, for example,
mm,
uh, peacemaking circle model is a primary model, and that's what we use mostly, or use still in
mm,
Oakland schools, and to some extent in the justice system as well. And that circle is a sacred space. We curate that space very intentionally. And if you are a trained peacemaking circle facilitator, you know. Um, and so the circle has 5 elements. First, ceremony. We begin when people get together in a circle, whether it's a conflict circle to address conflict that has arisen, or a proactive sort of community building circle, trust building circle, where no harm has necessarily occurred specifically,
mm,
but you are coming together to be in deep connection with one another. You're coming together to create this culture of connectivity.
mm,
Um, so, ceremony, um, values,
mm,
um, circle keeper. Um, they'll come to me in a moment. It's hard for me to think linear like that
mhm,
just off the top of my head, but let's just talk about each of these 5 elements. Consensus is one. Um, and I started with ceremonies. As I indicated a little bit earlier, um, ceremony, it opens a space, it creates a sense of sacredness. Um, and you can open the space with a very simple ceremony. It can be a quote. Um, it can be movement. It can be meditation,
it's an,
which allows you to become grounded and fully present in the space.
yeah,
Anything that sort of allows you to land there and be fully present to the humanity, the beauty,
yeah.
and also the ugliness of life,
Mm.
in a good way. Yeah.
You
Mhm.
know, as I'm hearing you, I'm also realizing that the tenets of a peacemaking circle are so far from the noisiness of our day to day. We have so little ceremony in our busyness, and so few opportunities unless we bring that intention to our lives, right? To really
Mhm.
hear one another in terms of what it means to hope and heal together, right?
Yes.
There's a very different sort of forgiveness and a very sort of different accountability when it relates to restorative justice.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. And
Please talk
and
a little
and
bit about that. Yes.
yeah. Well, um, accountability is definitely a very important um, aspect of restorative justice. Many people think, oh, you just slapping the person who caused harm on the
Mm,
wrist and letting them get away.
mm,
Accountability is huge. That's one of the 3 basic values,
mm,
fundamental values of restorative justice and of Indigenous culture. Respect, responsibility, and relationality.
mm,
Uh, and I want to talk about that in a moment. I want to continue to talk a bit more about the circle and how we create that sacred space. If we talked about ceremony being important. We open with ceremony and we close with ceremony. We have a circle keeper whose job is not to run the circle or to manage an agenda and tick off each item. It's to allow the circle to run itself. Its job, or his or her job, is to create a space where every person feels that they can freely share their truths and be vulnerable. And that idea that every voice matters in this circle. There's no one important person voice, no facilitator that we need to all listen to who's the fountain of all wisdom. Every voice, whether it's a 14-year-old child or the principal of the school or the mayor of the city. And we've had circles with young people, with those kinds of people who hold positional power. But the job of the circle keeper is to create that space where every voice matters. The talking piece that we use is also really important. Whoever's holding the talking piece is the only one that is talking, and you're talking with respect and deeply and from your heart. And whoever is not holding the talking piece is listening. You talked about listening deeply and with respect. And when we listen deeply, we open ourselves up to change and to growth and to transformation. Yes. Yeah, and you're not waiting for the person who's talking, to finish so you can say what you want to say. You're not thinking about what you're going to say in response. You are truly grounded there and listening with the heart and with the mind at what is being said by the person holding the talking piece.
When I'm hearing you speak about this, I'm also thinking about so many other applications of these kinds of tools, and movements of the heart actually is what you're speaking about, right? What it means to listen carefully, to not always think about ourselves first, to think about the community that we're in and the health of a larger body of people. I do lots of work in international education and in travel. And one of the things that UW Study Abroad and many other people that I'm in conversation with are thinking more about is, how do we empower young people to be out and about in a globalized and globalizing world, and to do it with equity in their minds, with deep listening in their hearts, without the sense of entitlement that often comes from having more, especially engaging with folks who might have less. But how do we stitch justice into some of our activities as students, as staff, as faculty, as community members, right? What does it mean to bring that decolonizing value to travel? What does it mean to bring a decolonizing lens to community safety, right?
Wow.
I see so many links in what you are sharing, and in so many of the ways that we are trying to build those tools and skills and space for more collectivity, for more collaboration.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. This whole shift in ethos from an ethos of domination and division and discord to an ethos of collaboration and cooperation and interrelationality. It's a shift that we as a species must make. We're not going to be able to go on otherwise. So it's great that your students are getting those kinds of experiences. It brings to mind something that I have to say about restorative justice. As a lawyer, civil rights trial lawyer, as a warrior for justice, basically, when I first learned about restorative justice, I was really interested in the intersections of racial and restorative justice. So, of course, one of the first things I did was to Google race and restorative justice. I found almost nothing
Nothing. Right.
Almost nothing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
35 years, almost 40 years of the restorative justice movement, and no conversations, no consciousness about race, about racial justice. It was just kind of flabbergasting for me.
Yes.
On the one hand. On the other hand, I said, okay, this is systemic racism. This is white supremacy. It has it permeates and it pervades all of our institutions and all of our collective consciousness. So in some ways, I was not surprised. It's not unlike, after all, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the peace movement. They all, especially in early years, for most of those movements, were very white and without very much consciousness. It's changed now. Let me just quickly say that. I won't get into details, but largely because more and more people of color are becoming facilitators in the restorative justice movement from places like Oakland, which is the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. And we've had conferences where we've been very, very intentional and strategic and deliberate about starting that conversation. I think a group of people, a group of us probably in 2013 started to do that. And today you have more people of color, more formerly incarcerated, more youth, more LGBTQ plus, and more books and articles and convenings and conferences on the intersections of race and restorative justice. We've talked about it a lot. I'd really love for the audience, for you guys out there to see this short film. It's only 3 minutes on what is restorative justice.
I think what we will do is we will certainly send the link to the film to everybody who's here today. We've got about half hour left and we have a long list of questions and engagement from our participants today. So I would like to make sure that we've got some time to hear from some of our participants. Fania, please.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Jennifer and Gary have asked a great question. Isn't it important to understand the cause of harm so that going forward, change can happen? What would restorative justice say for this, please?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Restorative justice addresses needs, responsibilities, and it seeks to come up with a plan to address that harm, to heal it to the degree possible, for sure. And sometimes the causes are like in the school work that we did. A lot of time the cause of harm caused by young people was essentially racialized trauma.
Yes.
Children whose parents were not necessarily present because they were incarcerated and trying to make it on their own. A young man whose mother had relapsed and in her own suffering left him alone with a couple of other siblings. And then he gets to school after helping his younger siblings, eat and getting them ready for school and getting himself ready for school, a 14-year-old, right? He gets there and he's not paying attention. His head is down on the desk because he's tired, he's sleepy, he's anxious. And the teacher tells him 3 times to get your head up, Tommy. And he doesn't. And then she really presses him. He jumps up and was yelling at her. And they wanted to suspend him initially, but because we had a restorative justice program, the restorative justice coordinator said, can we try something else? Can we try a circle here? And so the restorative justice coordinator got him in the room and found out what his story was. Normally, with zero tolerance, you just, you broke a rule, you cursed at the teacher, you're out of here for 5 or 10 days.
Yes.
And you don't bother to get the story. You don't bother to learn the cause of the harm.
Right.
And so, when the story comes out, the principal says, the principal was ready to just write him a slip and get him out immediately until the restorative justice coordinator intervened. But the principal said, here, we were about to suspend this young man. when we should have been giving him a medal.
Mm.
And, the school to prison pipeline is implicated here because if a child is suspended once by the 9th grade, their chances of being incarcerated triple, their chances of dropping out double.
Yes.
So keeping that environment of healing and culture of connectivity within the schools, keeping a child in school is the most important protective factor against incarceration, both as a child, as an adult.
Let's go from school to thinking about universities and colleges. When you and I spoke a few days ago, we were talking about what an amazing moment this is that we are starting to hear restorative justice processes at universities around the country, right? And Shannon has asked a great question here. What concrete steps would you recommend for a university to take to begin implementing and incorporating a restorative justice model?
University of California, Berkeley. Oh, that's here. You're there. You're in Seattle. But so there's lots that can be done. I was going to say, this would be a good resource here in Berkeley, California, the university here. But so first, you don't want to do two. You want to do with. That's an important tenet of restorative justice. So you don't want the president of the school, the director of a program to come in, the director of a department come in and say to his employees or her employees, we're going to do restorative justice. And this is the law now. This is what is required now. Right. No top-down, directive in that way. You want to implement or consider implementing restorative justice in a restorative way. Restorative way. Yes. Doing with instead of to, and engaging as many people as possible on the ground. What are your thoughts? How can we do this if you're in? So that is number one, engage people on the ground and build the foundation from the ground up instead of a very unsustainable program would result from top down. And there are training, you'd want to get people trained once the collective, whatever that might be within the university, decides it wants to do restorative justice, identify trainers and start training people until you get as many, you continue to train until you get as many people trained as possible. Now, David Karp down at San Diego, I think, is it UCSD? Has a restorative justice center down there. He wrote the little book on restorative justice in colleges and universities. So, of course, he's a great resource. And the director of the Restorative Justice Center here at UC Berkeley is also a great resource. I'm losing her name. Oh, Julie Hackford Bailey is her name. So yeah, once you get everyone trained, then you can start using restorative justice in faculty meetings. You can start using restorative justice in student conduct issues. You can use restorative justice when racial conflict arises, for example, or gender-based conflict arises. But you are right, Anu, there is a real burgeoning of restorative justice programs in higher education.
What I hear from you is that there's not a particular kind of case that restorative justice seeks to heal. Restorative justice is the tool and the lens and the medium in which we open conversation up, where we invite backstory and context into the room, as opposed to saying you are just what you've done, but there is a wider context in which we are all located, right?
Well said, absolutely.
This is a great segue into another question from our participant, Jeff. How do we scale up this process from dozens of people to, say, an entire community, whether at a local, a provincial, or a national level? How do you go from that school that started to listen to that young student and think about that movement in wider scales? What does that look
Yeah,
like?
that's a beautiful question. And
Mhm.
let me start, or let me respond by sharing how we got started
Please.
um, in Oakland. We started in Oakland in a small school in West Oakland, in one of the most crime-ridden and uh, 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 poor community, poorest communities of Oakland, and we didn't do it with a lot of fanfare or flair. The district did not know that we were doing this. The superintendent of the school district had no idea.
Mm.
The school board had no idea, but we sort of quietly, started, and very quickly, within less than a year, we saw suspension rates just plummet.
Mm. Mm.
87% reduction in suspension rates. And imagine how many youth we're saving from the school to prison pipeline.
Wow.
We saw an end to violence because young people learned how to talk through and instead of fight through their differences. If they were out in the schoolyard and having a difference of opinion, they would come in and say, Miss Alfred, she was a restorative justice coordinator at the school, we need a talking stick so we can sit down and
Wow.
talk this through. Yeah.
Mm.
And there were some positive academic outcomes as well. And the school became a more pleasant place. And so teacher attrition rate went down. Teachers stayed there.
Mm.
And then we contacted UC Berkeley Law. Somehow they found out about us and they did a study. And before we know it, other principals were knocking down our door.
Mm-hmm.
And then the school district, with some organizing by students, decided to adopt restorative justice as official school policy.
Mm-hmm.
So it grew very organically.
Yes.
And again, no top-down directive.
Right.
And this is a little thorny because some people, especially activists, I'm an activist, of course, but activists who are not, we call them restorganizers, who tend to be more binary and oppositional and combative in their approach. I saw as I traveled across the country that sometimes they were demanding, having demonstrations and humiliating the school board and demanding restorative justice. But first of all, we won't have as much success if it happens from the top, from the school board or the superintendent. Yes. And we definitely won't have success if we do a program using this energy. Again, we want to create the program, applying the same energy that we hope will sort of pervade the work. So, you'd want to be very, very firm, but more collaborationist and approach the powers that be, with a more a partner with a proposal about partnering and sharing power, to do this work.
Yeah, that partnership, right? The partnership when it is so fraught, the partnership when there is so much pain, the partnership when there is so much inequity that we're trying to navigate through can be really challenging, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is so true. Yeah. And that's why when you do enter these partnerships that you want to hold fast to your values, first of all. And you want to insist that government share power with communities and with ordinary people. And if you have support in the community, and we didn't feel that we were being coerced into doing things that we thought were contrary to our values as restorative justice practitioners. We didn't even get money in the beginning from the school district either. So that's a fraught, you're right. That's a really fraught subject. But back to the question, so creating a program and allowing it and cultivating, planting the seed. You start small, really, I believe. You don't try to do a big program
right
from the start. And with the work that we've done in the school district, and we've had challenges, money, budgets, and it's not easy. We are not in all of the schools yet, but we are in quite a number of the schools, and it is official policy. We're also doing work in the justice system, in the juvenile justice system in particular.
I can't think of a single site or a single group of people that could not benefit from some of the principles of restorative justice.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I say this as a teacher, I say this as a facilitator who is in many different kinds of institutions and in many different kinds of groups, being able to hold one another accountable outside of simply a lens of blame and through a lens of healing is something that we so rarely have, right? And especially in this moment, right? How do we bring together participants from various backgrounds to confront the shared history of racial difference? When we're talking about a restorative journey, right? When there's so much violence to dignity, how do you stay grounded and focused in where you are? And as you say earlier, to be able to see what you want at the end and to use that as kind of the thread that pieces together our journey. What's some advice that you have or some thoughts you have around that?
Self-care, for one thing. Having some sort of mind-body awareness practice. So much of this work is about modeling non-punitive ways of responding, first of all. And then we are conditioned, of course, to respond in punitive ways because of the pervasiveness of harm in our culture, not just in the justice system. It's staggering when we think, ours is a culture, is a nation that is born in genocide, land theft, slavery, the slave trade, heteropatriarchy, oceans of blood that we are born in.
Oceans.
And structural racism, white supremacy, racial terror. And it continues. Because we never actually faced and confronted in an unflinching way and healed those original birth wounds, we perpetually reenact them.
Always. It's here in the room.
It's here, and it's the air that we breathe. It's a colossus of harm that we're experiencing, because that harm pervades and permeates and saturates all of our institutions, our collective consciousness. And we kind of take it for granted, but when you think about the harm that, I was talking about origin stories earlier, my own personal origin story. This is the origin story of our nation. It's who we are. As Dr. King said, we are this country is the greatest purveyor of harm and violence on earth. And, it's those systems live outside of us, but they also live inside of us. So we harm ourselves, we harm our children, we harm our communities, we harm our families, we harm our earth.
And so much of restorative justice, right? And this is part of the indigenous roots of these ways of being. It's embedded in respect, community, and a shared sense of responsibility. Our participant Nikki asks, what kind of work needs to be done to combat skepticism regarding restorative justice and its efficacy in preventing future harm? Because modern society so often lacks those core beliefs of community, of collective responsibility.
Oh yeah, we're right up against. It's everything that restorative justice stands for is antithetical to
Yes.
what the prevailing values are.
Yes, yes.
And that's why I'm so grateful today that we are finally awakening to this. There's an anti-racist awakening, the likes of which I have never seen before. Ibrahim Kendi called it in the latest Atlantic an anti-racist revolution, but so back to the question, what do we do to combat skepticism? I think the questioner asked. We put our nose to the grinder and we just do the work, and don't put a lot of energy, don't give a lot of energy to the naysayers, because that will only bring you down. Build up this beautiful circle, this beautiful healing space, these beautiful healing spaces. And some of the skeptics may join you. The fence sitters will sure enough, we saw that from schools experiences. The fence sitters, once they saw how well these programs worked in terms of reducing and eliminating violence and all of that, they jumped off the fence and jumped on the bandwagon. Sometimes you're going to have resistors who will forever be resistors. That's just who they are. The key is that you don't get distracted. You focus on making the most beautiful, most healing, most effective program that you can.
This moves so nicely into another question that our friend Fiona has offered. Can you speak to bringing restorative justice into everyday interactions in our places of learning, working, in living? I'm thinking especially of situations where we see some hurt or harm. Do you have any advice on being proactive in addressing that?
Actually, that is happening. Restorative justice programs are, I'd say for the last 10, 12, maybe even 15 years are just really mushrooming all over the world, including here. When we first got started in Oakland at that middle school in 2007, we were the first actually restorative justice program in an urban district in California. And we were virtually the first program, period, I think, in all of California. Today, there are hundreds of restorative justice programs in schools. They started mostly in high schools because, you get all of the press about the violence in the high schools, even though it makes more sense to start with the little ones.
Little, yes.
Yeah. But today there are programs in elementary schools and middle schools in districts all over the state and all over the country, actually. So it is growing in that kind of organic way nationally. We also seeing the growth of restorative justice in the justice system,
yes,
as well as in communities. In Oakland, we are just getting started in doing our work in the community because we were able to get significant funding in the beginning for schools, and then mostly for schools. And then very recently, now we are doing a lot of this work in communities. And I'm really interested in this whole idea of restorative cities. I think we mentioned earlier that there are restorative cities in different parts of the world where this vision that the earlier caller had or the early questioner had, there's this, the whole idea of of restorative justice in schools, restorative justice in community, restorative justice in the justice system, restorative justice in families, in churches.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You know, I want to just take a moment to think about how unusual a conversation like this is, especially one that is being offered from an Office of Global Affairs. We have not been traveling, most of us, this year, and we're not quite sure when we will begin. And in this year of not doing what we usually do, the hope is that we can think through with a little bit more intentionality and a little bit more critical pause. What have we been doing? Has it been working? How have we been harming ourselves and the earth and each other? What would it mean to move towards more healing in that? I'm seeing these conversations in the travel industry, within study abroad, within racial equity conversations within the US, in a range of places, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today's conversation is very much moving that forward. Tonight, we have gathered with us, we have students, we have staff, we have faculty, community members, we have justice warriors, and we have justice healers. Fania, please tell us, what are your thoughts and recommendations for us as a community who are here gathered tonight to advance this conversation? What might be a next step for all of us who are here witnessing and listening tonight?
Thank you for that question. One, actually, Seattle is really moving along in terms of its restorative justice programs and consciousness. I just want to give a shout out to Seattle for that. I've been there. I went there some years ago when a lot of the work was getting started there. And then Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJOY, the organization that I co-founded and directed for many years until recently, did a number of trainings there for restorative justice in schools as well. So, you've got resources right there in your own backyard, assuming you're in Seattle. Of course, you may not be in Seattle these days. So that's number one. There's lots of literature out there as well if you want to learn more about restorative justice.
Yes.
And there's plenty of there's the little book series, like you saw my book, right? Anna just held it up. There's a little book of restorative justice. There's a little book of peacemaking circle processes. There's a little book of restorative justice in education. There's a little book of restorative justice in prisons. So it is a wonderful resource if you want to learn more. That whole little book of justice series, little books of justice series. And then in terms of travel abroad, Anu, I will reiterate, there are so many restorative cities projects around the world.
Yes.
There's an international learning community up in Halifax, Canada. So there's just the possibilities are endless, and I really look forward to maybe just kind of working through some of those with you in the near future. Yes. But there's so many creative things that you can do. There's truth and reconciliation work that is happening. Of course, it's starting to happen here, but in other countries as well, which is considered applying restorative justice to mass social wounds, as opposed to interpersonal, individual conflicts. So that and then I just recommend too that you take care of yourself. You do that mind-body practice, because we are being invited to really not only transform our institutions, which have been contaminated and infected by white supremacy, like the policing systems. But it's really, when you think about it, all of our institutions have. And so this is a time not only of awakening, we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but an incredible awakening in terms of white people's consciousness around race. And it's a time of re-envisioning new futures, of totally transforming ourselves, transforming the public policing, of course. Restorative justice is a transformed, just a different kind of justice. But we need to reimagine all of our institutions and really reimagine what it means to be human.
I think it's such a perfect way to think about a closing for this evening, with these two different energies and these two different identities and two different skills that we have been talking about in different ways. What does it mean to imbibe being a warrior? What does it mean to imbibe being a healer? And this is for our communities and for our society and our nation and our global nations. This is also within ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
As I've said
Absolutely.
all evening, yes. None of this is simply outside. So much of this resides in us.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Our ancestors
Absolutely.
are residing in us. Our history is residing in us as well, no?
Right, right. And this is kind of what I mean by the warrior and the healer, really. The way that we were activists back in the 60s and 70s is, we were angry, as I said, and so angry that I became ill, ended up, having that transformation. But we never thought that there was anything that we needed to change about us.
Right.
It was all them, those bad systems, they are wrong, we are right. We are good, they are bad, and they've got to go. But this notion of understanding that, in a reality that is as deeply interconnected as ours is, and quantum physics is telling us that, of course, the ancients knew it as well, that we are part of those systems. Yes. Those systems live outside of us and within us. Outside and within. And if we just focus on changing those systems outside of us, we won't succeed. We'll continue to reenact all of that harm from our beginnings, as we talked about. So, and if we just work on ourselves, we will continue to reenact, the racial terror, the systems of domination, the harm, the ineffable harm. So my view is that is why I believe we need to do both.
Absolutely. Dr. Fania Davis, I would love to spend 10 hours in conversation with you.
Let's do it one day.
This has been such a beautiful evening with you and with everyone who has joined us, and all of our participants who will see this video later. I want to just thank you so sincerely for being with us this evening. Your vibe, your knowledge, and your trust in us, makes me retrust myself, makes me retrust each other, right?
Wow.
So
I'm just so honored, That's so beautifully put, and never heard that before. So
well, that is
you've been an incredible partner to journey with, to travel with, to explore with.
My thanks to you. My thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Our thanks to our sponsors for helping put together this event. We will be sending everyone who has registered an email to hear your thoughts on tonight's event and some ways to connect with both Fania and I. We'll also send you links to the video that Fania mentioned earlier, so please do be on the lookout for that. Warriors, healers, friends, and community members, good night, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you, Fania.
Thank you. Good night. Blessings and peace.